Hello everyone and welcome to this session on data extraction for mixed methods reviews. My name is Andrew Booth. I work at the University of Sheffield at SHAR and I'm a member of the Cochrane Qualitative and Implementation Methods Group. So where do we sit within the whole process of a mixed method review? Well, as you can see from the left-hand side here, we've reached stage 9 of extracting the data, and this is closely associated with stage 8, assessing study quality. And similarly, in the Keze-SACE framework from PLI on the right-hand side, we can see that appraisal and extract are again located close together at about the same point of the process. So it's helpful to think of these activities as being closely associated. You are making a final assessment of the eligibility of the study. Having got through the study criteria, you start to see the data that supports a particular research question. We can use this as an opportunity to assess the quality of the study. Some people choose to do this at the same time. Others do the assessment of quality of study prior to data extraction. In some cases, making it dependent upon the quality assessment, and others choose to do the extraction of study data and then move on to assessing the quality. But in any of these circumstances, they're closely associated. So data extraction has been nicely described by Cooper as an attempt to reduce a complex, messy, context-laden and quantification-resistant reality to a matrix of categories and numbers. And this is a particularly appropriate definition in the context of mixed methods reviews, because we're actually seeking to make this this matrix even more complex and even more messy by deliberately seeking data that may be textual, may be numerical, or may take other forms. So a process that's already time consuming in terms of both the design of the forms and the actual extraction of data is made even more so in the context of mixed methods reviews, and the process, which is already complex, is far from straightforward in this additional complex situation. So in terms of the data that we extract, well, Prisma has consistently stated that we should list and define all variables for which data was sought. It suggests that PCOS should be a building block for this data extraction process, accompanied by perhaps considerations on a meta study level, such as funding sources, or in the context of qualitative research, this might be reflexivity about the positionality of the authors, and that it should also include any assumptions and simplifications made, whether these be in terms of what constitutes data, whether, for example, verbatim extracts only are to be used, or whether accompanied by author observations, or indeed whether themes that have been already generated by the authors will be used, or whether we will be extracting and then assigning our own themes. And there are similar considerations about conversion of metrics into common measures, such as ratios or percentages. So in terms of the data that we extract in more detail, you'll see that PICO figures prominently in the left-hand side of this display, but we could consider in the context of mixed methods using our septic toe structure, because this includes elements that are useful for both, such as the setting, the direct context in which the intervention is delivered, the environment, that broader context that might include regulation or political climate or stage of economic development, and other elements that are more specific to the qualitative part of the mixed method review, such as the perspective, the phenomenon of interest, and evaluation, so extending beyond hard outcomes to the attitudes and preferences. So we're encouraged to choose and define our fields to make sure that they're relevant to the review question using this septic toe format. We should provide guidance notes for our data extractors, for example, on how to extract consistently. So, for example, whether we're going to record something as percentage female or percentage F, and when we're going to simplify or categorize. So, for example, a raw age range from an article may be coded separately as covering the period we define as child and as adolescent. And this decision on whether we're going to extract textual data verbatim or whether we'll abbreviate or paraphrase. We're talking here about the descriptive data. The recommendation would be that qualitative findings should always try to preserve the exact nature of the context and to include verbatim quotations. Some particular issues here for mixed methods. Will you have separate forms for quantitative and qualitative data? And if so, how will you handle data that is common to both? So, for example, the context. Will you extract that in both forms, or will you assign it to either the quantitative or the qualitative form? Or will you have a single form with one type of data, say the quantitative, followed by the other, the qualitative, or with separate branches, as Google Forms allows you to do for the qualitative, the quantitative, and the mixed data? A third consideration, will you collect data for the same outcome in the same field, regardless of whether it's quantitative or qualitative? So essentially using that field as a dumping ground, if you like, for relevant data on the same element. Or will we produce a quantitative field and a qualitative field for the same outcome? So that, for example, in the quantitative field, we have a pain score, and in the qualitative field, we have a person's experience of pain. And so here we're trading between the value of having a one-stop shop, where we know exactly where to look for information when we come to subsequent analysis, versus being able to control the format. And this is important if, for example, we're using Excel and we want to use sort or filter functions. And a fourth consideration is that will having something present or absent in a field be sufficient to indicate fulfillment of that field, or will you assign some sort of categorization like yes, no, or unclear in a box alongside that field, again to facilitate some sorting process. In terms of the data that we extract, we need to move beyond the idea that when we're extracting a quantitative article, that we're only extracting for that article, because it may well be that data in the quantitative paper may help us in interpreting the qualitative. So we're actually extracting with an eye to both arms, even when we're dealing with perhaps a separate paper. And this applies also in terms of whether we're planning any subgroup analyses. So subgroup analyses identified statistically may well determine or drive our requirements to have specific fields in our data extraction form for subgroups into which we put our qualitative data. And a further consideration is whether there are any potential confounders in quantitative terms or characteristics in qualitative terms that we will need to identify and extract by way of explaining the context of individual responses. And it's helpful also to think of what other facts may help us to explain differences in results. So we think of differences in the setting or in the regulatory environment. These may determine how people respond qualitatively, or may explain differences in effect size. It's helpful, as we've said, to think about quality assessment at this point, regardless of what your preferences are in terms of the actual process. And if we are going to include quality assessment in our data extraction form, as many do, then we face the same issues as already mentioned. Will we have separate quality assessment forms? Will we combine them sequentially, so we have to fill out responses for one followed by the other, or will they be integrated within a single quality assessment scale or tool, in which case how will we organize that particular form, and will we use branching again to negotiate between different combinations of quantitative and qualitative. In terms of software, there's no set requirement for software other than to say it becomes more complex than just a single review, because as well as the generic types of software like Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, or Google Docs, then we face decisions as to whether we're specifically going to use NVivo for our qualitative data or RevMan for our quantitative data, and we'll want to design the form with an eye to those additional packages as well. Google Docs in the form of forms or sheets can be used both for inputting data, but also for generating progress reports and for summarizing in the form of tables. So here is what looks like a data extraction form. If you look closely, you'll see it's not actually a raw data extraction form, that there's been an element of processing or tidying up here, so that we can see that in the fact that the data is standardized in the various columns. For example, the population column here contains two elements that we're unlikely to have input together, the history of adenomas and the age group. And so it's likely in our original form that these would have been two separate fields that have then gone through a process of merging. So some issues to think about here. Well, with our form, we need to balance the detail of the form with its utility. So we need to look back at the original protocol to see what our main variables and hypotheses and review questions are. We want to avoid overly white space on the form, so that we're not spending a lot of time navigating it, or we're not being prompted for lots of data that we can't use to inform the analysis because it's only partially reported. On the other hand, we don't want our forms to be overly minimalist, in which case we may end up with many marginal notes, or we may have to go back to the articles to do a further round of data extraction. Therefore, piloting the form is important, but in a mixed methods context, we have additional considerations, because we need to think about the overall configurational balance of the type of studies that we'll be looking at. So, for example, they may be mainly quantitative studies with a little amount of qualitative data, or they may be studies that pay equal attention to quantitative and qualitative, or they may be primarily qualitative with just a reference to the main features of a parent trial, for example, or they may be two or more separate papers. And so this sort of what I've called the style of these papers may well determine the sequence of the form. It may well determine the balance of the form and how much attention that we concentrate on the quantitative and qualitative components that make up the overall data extraction form. So some issues that we already encounter when, for example, doing quantitative systematic reviews become more important in a mixed methods context. So we're already familiar that quantitative studies may have different units of measurement or different outcome measures, but to that complexity we add a further consideration that the same element may be captured quantitatively or qualitatively, as with our example of pain scores and the experience of pain. And we need to decide whether we're going to analyze these separately or whether we're going to bring these together, perhaps in some sort of matrix, and our data extraction form needs to prepare us for that decision. So in terms of requirements, Prisma consistently asks us to describe our methods of data extraction from the reports, whether we've piloted forms, whether this process has taken place independently, whether more than one reviewer has been involved, and any processes for obtaining and confirming data. That may not always be possible, but we should refer to the fact that we well, at least document the missing data. So as a consequence, we need to use well-designed piloted data extraction forms. We need to train data extractors, perhaps coding for 2 to 4 studies with a mixture of quantitative and qualitative elements, and maybe use this as an opportunity for some inter-rater reliability comparison across important outcomes. We'll optimally use 2 blinded data extractors, but if not, some permutation of 2 people being involved. So it may well be that if a data extractor is primarily quantitative in background, that we have a qualitative based data extractor who just checks the columns of the spreadsheet associated with the qualitative data extraction, both for consistency and for quality. And as with any data extraction, we need a process by which we are able to resolve any issues, whether this be through consultation or through a single arbiter, a third person. Now, there are elements of guidance in the, for example, the Joanna Briggs manual in the chapter on mixed methods. Not very much detail on data extraction in terms of the practicalities that we've covered in this presentation, but there is a sample data extraction form. Please be aware, though, that it's predicated on a convergent integrated model, so it's a combined data extraction form rather than a convergent segregated model, which would involve separate extraction forms. But perhaps it's also opportune to be thinking in terms of extraction across a cluster of papers. So here we have, for example, 3 randomized controlled trials, we have process evaluation, we have some qualitative studies, a mixed methods study, a questionnaire study, and these all relate to the same phenomenon, and we need to think of the added value of being able to extract data against all of these and building up a mosaic or a composite, if you like, where the study, not the paper, is the unit of analysis. And certainly in areas where there are few influential studies with multiple outputs, this is a strong model. So in summary, you need to consider what are the important data that you need to answer your question based on the septic-toe framework that accommodates mixed method aspects. We need to think of the important data that we need to contextualize the results, so operating, as we said, across both the quantitative and the qualitative arm. and this would include considerations of the direct setting in which care is delivered, the environment, the broader regulatory or political or legislative environment, aspects of perspective as well, and any subgroup analyses that can run both through the quantitative and qualitative aspects of the review. And we also need to design and pilot our form to accommodate both quantitative and qualitative data. We need to take our time and double check our extractions and those of others, particularly if we're extracting in a paradigm that we're less familiar with. And above all, to record our decisions, why we made them as well, to help resolve ambiguity, to act as a means of communicating these decisions to other members of our review team, and in preparation for any concerns expressed at the peer review stage. So thank you for your attention, and we'll now move on to the next stage of the